Hi everyone, we are Team Adoptium, and we have three students in our group, including Shiyu, Amanda Nguyen, and Paul Saunders. And we are all from University of Alberta, and our mentors are Sophia, Shelley, Lambert, and Xia. And you might be wondering, what is Adoptium? The Adoptium working group promotes and supports free and open source high-quality runtimes and associated technology for use across the Java ecosystem. We build and provide open JDK binaries under Eclipse type mirroring. Our work concerns the AQAvit test projects for Adoptium, whose main repos are AQTests TKG and AQTest tools. Here's our project outline.
So let's illustrate our project outline with an example. So each night we have a test session that runs called a nightly that essentially validates the latest day's build. During that test run, let's say right at the start, that build fails with some type of test error. It doesn't matter which one. The next day, by the time that error is figured out, or sorry, by the time that error is discovered that actually happened, the repositories that were used in that test run have changed. And so now we need to recreate that test session in order to figure out and better understand why that test error occurred and to fix it. The old way of doing it was with a file called sha.txt, which was almost entirely created for human purposes. It listed git repository, git branch sha. It listed all this stuff rather nicely, but it was not applicable to put into a machine and parse it that way. And so we had to figure out a way to not only better encapsulate what a test session's environment variables were, but incorporate that into a brand new test session to make it easier to reproduce and ultimately fix the bug that caused the issue. So the existing way that you would be doing this is with this button on the right. This is in Jenkins, which is a CI/CD framework. This rebuild button just duplicates the test session with all the same environment variables, or not even the environment variables, just the same arguments to the test session. Now that works, but if you don't have access to this grinder or you want to do something else, you have to manually copy and paste each of those arguments into another framework that you want. What we did is we wanted to create as this test.env.properties file, which would just output all of the arguments into a single file that could then be very easily parsed by a program. So you wouldn't have to click this rebuild, and you could actually share this test.env.properties file to other people or even across the world, and they could easily recreate the test session without having access to this Jenkins necessarily. So on the right here, you see the sha.txt. It looks very nice to read. You have a timestamp, repository dir, and all that, but it's not fun to parse. There's a lot of unnecessary information, like all these equal signs, the spaces, how it's not consistent on different lines. And so we wanted to fix all of this. And so as I said before, this test.env.properties file, we wanted to store and transmit these environment variables or input parameters using this file. We also wanted to create a bill of materials, which is essentially just a more formalized test.env.properties file containing those input parameters, but also a few other information that might not be necessary for that run, but would let the developer have a better understanding of what actually occurred in that test session that failed.
Perfect. So our use case 2 was the AQAvit certification. So on the right there, you can see a mock-up of what our marketplace will look like potentially. So right now, all of our vendors, they have their own binaries listed on their own website, but in the future, we hope to kind of consolidate it all in one place. And so for them to do that, they have to meet 3 criteria essentially to be added to the marketplace. The first one being they have to be a member of our working group. Their binaries have to pass TCK tests. And third, their binaries have to pass the AQA tests, which is where we come in. Perfect. So what the workflow looks like right now is that when a user runs their binaries through our tests, they produce TAP files. And so ideally what we want to be able to do is receive a set of TAP files from them, store their parsed content into our MongoDB database, and then display the results on our current website. So on the next slide here, to break it down into what the tasks actually look like, the first thing is that we have to standardize the tap names. I'll go into a little bit this later. The second one is that you have to set the tap file name in the Jenkins pipeline. The third one is that you have to create an API endpoint for actually like taking in the tap files, parsing them, and then storing it into the data. And then the fourth final step is actually creating the AQAvit certification view. And then we'll go into our accomplishments.
So on the right, you can see this is an example test in property file. And consuming this file property is one of the most crucial tasks to realize a reproducible test. So I was mainly responsible for consuming the testing property file in the testing pipeline using scripting languages like Ant and the Shell script. First thing I did was to add a use testing property flag in the Jenkins file space, load values from there, from the testing properties, and set them to as an environment variable. If the flag is set to true, if the flag is set to false, it will just use the normal parameters in the granders. The second thing I did was to consume all the attributes in testing property file inside both the system and the OpenJDK tests by updating their respective XML files. Then I update the logic to accept the char of the test branch instead of accepting only the name of the branch. Finally, I perform in-depth tests of my finished works on the test grinder and cover different edge cases as well. The next thing I did was to create a initial AQAvit certification web page view using React. I also consumed the corresponding AQAvit certification API.
Perfect. So my focus was on that AQAvit certification. So the first problem I had to solve was our tap files right now, when they're generated, they're called test target result.tap, which obviously isn't great if we're going to be receiving a bunch of them. So the first thing I had to do was standardize the tap file names based on the test target and also some user parameters. So you can see that example is a lot more clear. You can really differentiate between them. A small detail you should pay attention to is the JDK math, which is a singular test target in that example, but then a user is also able to set a list of tests they want to test against, essentially. But instead of like printing out every single test, we'll just call it test list. And then part two of this problem was setting the tap name in the Jenkins pipeline. So before the hard-coded value, I had to remove any mention of that. And then so now we're just grabbing files that end in .tap. And then the next one, so this is the big honcho. This is where I spent a lot of my time. So this is creating the API endpoint to process and store the tap files. So on the left there, you can see an example of a tap file name. So I'll use the information there to grab what I needed. But as well, in the tap file, you can see below there, that's kind of an example of what it looks like. So right there, I have two tests. So machine info has a status of okay, so it passed, everything's all good. But you can see that math load test is not okay. So then that obviously I have to represent that as a failure. So the input for the API is a zip of a bunch of these tap files. So the first thing I had to do was create like a root document that kind of links everything together. And then if I have a tap file with test list in its name, as you can see on the left. So I'll have like test list 0, test list 1. They're all going to be grouped under this artificial parent. So I had to create an artificial parent document. And then from there, I'm able to create the tap file documents and link them to the artificial parent. Otherwise, if my tap file was like JDK math, which is a regular target, I wouldn't need the artificial parent. Not done yet. Every single tap file has the contents that you see on the left. So I had to be able to parse through every single tap file. Every single tap file might have 10, 30, 50 tests within them. And then I had to insert every singular test into the database. And so they all kind of link together. Super hard, but super fun. I think you're muted, Paul.
Yeah, muted. Thank you. So whereas Shiyu's tasks mainly concerned consuming the test.properties file, my tasks focused around creating and generating that test.env file, as well as archiving it so it persists after the run terminates. September was mostly dedicated to understanding their different requirements towards a pull request in Adoptium repositories. There are a few guidelines that I wasn't quite familiar with, and as it turns out, fixed bug is not a good commit message when other people need to actually read it. But once I got that all fleshed out, I was able to get working on the main task in October, as well as a few different arbitrary tasks when I was waiting for my pull requests to be merged. And so, for instance, one thing that we had is that we have a GitHub action in the repository where you can leave a comment on an issue specifying a specific test to disable, and it'll automatically go and disable that test. But we didn't have a way to re-enable that test. And so what we wanted to do is set up a way where if an issue is closed and a test was disabled in that issue, it automatically goes and re-enables that issue without any human intervention. And so that's something I did in the meantime, while I was waiting for a few things to get finished on the side. October is mostly dedicated towards the easier to get environment variables, things like the repository that you're actually working in, some of the main like OpenJNI and TKG, the main repositories that come from Adoptium. Whereas November was mainly dedicated to outside sources, things that aren't found in simple bash files and Ant scripts, things that are just kind of harder to navigate and incorporate into the existing Jenkins framework, I guess you could say. But I can solidly say that as it stands, the test.properties file is virtually completed. I do need to get a few more things fleshed out, but it essentially works, and we've been able to run test sessions and then export that test data and run it from other computers who have never actually accessed the original grinder session or the test session in the first place, which is exactly what we were looking for when we started this mission. And so now I wanted to talk about kind of what we, what kind of information we gained for ourselves over the course of this semester.
So for me, my major takeaways throughout the term is being that working in such a complex open source project that involves so many different technologies can be very challenging, but rewarding at the same time. I also had a better understanding of the essence of software engineer and how the testing of the software can play an important role in it. Yeah.
Perfect. So the most fun part for me was when I got to kind of hand off work. So when I completed the API, handing off to Shiyu, so he could create the view. That was really cool to see. And then at the beginning of the semester, you know, open source was a little scary, but I learned that like it really is approachable if you have the right mentors, if you have people supporting you. I'll pass it off to Paul.
Yeah, so one thing I didn't understand when I got into this is the sheer complexity of testing enterprise level applications. You know, as a student, you're mostly just used to running a single manual thing, testing it and being, oh, it's fine, and then just submitting it. But when it comes to full things that are used by millions or billions of people, you really need to be thorough in testing. And I think it really goes to show that there's no excuse not to test. I remember we're working on a testing framework, and I wrote a test for that framework, but it was such a complex test that I actually needed to add another test for that test. So I wrote a test for a test that was testing a testing framework, which was rather convoluted, but it goes to show if you have a simple assignment that you're working on, you should really just dedicate the hour or so that it takes to thoroughly test and make sure that it all works out. And yeah, so there's so much more to Java binaries than just running javac app.java as it goes to show. If you are interested in what we talked about today, you can find us on Twitter. We have a number of repositories on GitHub. So whether you're very interested in testing or you don't like testing, you'd rather just compile it and run it and hope for the best, we have stuff for you on GitHub. And then if you're just interested, you want to chat about the project, you can find us on Slack as well with that link.